Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, faculty, students, and friends, my name is Cornelia Woll. I am the president of the Hertie School and professor of international political economy. So I'm simultaneously your institutional host and co-organizer of today's conference. It is truly a great pleasure to welcome all of you here to the Hertie School, whether you are online or on site here in the Henrik Enderlein Forum, for a day of debating green industrial transitions in the European Union and in the United States. The idea of today's events grew out of conversations between myself, Nicola Brandt, and Brian Kaheen, who has joined us online, I believe. Brian is a digital economy fellow at the OECD's Directorate of Science, Technology and Innovation and senior fellow at the Computer and Communications Industry Association, and he's currently writing a book on the intersection of digital economies and public policy that draws on his long career in government, industry, and academia. And when we first discussed the return of industrial policy, the role of standard setting and digital technologies, as well as the political dynamics triggered in the EU and the US, we felt that a transatlantic discussion would be necessary. I guess we did not realize entirely how central this topic would become only half a year later. Triggered by the US Inflation Reduction Act, many countries started seeking for innovative answers to policy designs that would promote industrial innovation for a green transition without the spiral of a subsidies race. The EU's Green Industrial Plan has kept us busy here at the Hertie School, with our Jacques Delors Center focusing a substantial part of its work on the European challenges, and I'm glad to see that their work is laying on the side, if you're interested, together with the OECD publications, if you'd like to read on after our discussions. How to succeed the green industrial transition with smarter designs of science, technology, and innovation policies. How to understand and compare green industrial policies. The role of standard setting for the green and digital transformation and the promises of AI are at the heart of today's conference, and it could not be more timely. From our initial conversations, today's event developed into a truly collaborative effort, with many strong partners and hands getting involved to make the program better and enhance our cooperation. The Decarb Future Economy, a master and doctoral student initiative rooted in Berlin's university and increasingly also beyond, I see Oxford and Harvard are now on your list, chimed in to make the program much better, substantively, much more accessible, and more fun. I believe we owe you the Beer, Wine, and Pretzels initiative at the end of the day. We've also received support from the Berlin School of Economics and the Friends of the OECD, for which we're very grateful. Before I give the word to my co-hosts, Nicola and Nils, I would like to thank Nicola and her team at the OECD Berlin Center and Nils and his collaborators from the Decarb Future Economy Forum for the wonderful collaboration. Without Brian Kaheen, we would not be here in the first place, so let me acknowledge his vision and support once more. I would also like to thank the Hertie School team who worked tirelessly on the invisible logistical tasks with our partners, and let me single out Matt Longthorne from the communications team, who will make sure, together with the team here, that we stay hybrid throughout the day, as well as my personal associate, Maria Miltner, who is here and who has reliably held all the strings together. So without further ado, let me call Nicola up on stage to speak for the OECD.
Well, I think Cornelia has summarized it already very skillfully, so there's not much for me to add, only to say that I'm really looking forward to a day of interesting, timely, and relevant discussions with colleagues from Paris, Chiara Criscuolo and her team joining to present new work on quantifying industrial policy, but also we're talking about the role of industrial policy for innovation with my colleague Antoine Dechezleprêtre, and many other important issues such as standards, such as the interplay of digitization, digital and green transitions. And it's all thanks to Cornelia and her team for hosting us here, for being patient with new, incorporating new ideas, and also, of course, Brian Kaheen, who's basically the spiritus rector of this idea, and the colleagues from Decarb coming in at almost the last minute, but really improving on the program, as Cornelia said. And Nils, the floor is yours, and I'm looking forward to our first discussion.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for taking the time. We're very happy to welcome you for our first in-person Decarb event after 2 years of pandemic. And we are very grateful to join forces with the OECD and the Hertie School, hosted here by Cornelia Woll, President, and obviously also for the very generous support from the Berlin School of Economics, which made this event possible. And let me just quickly introduce the Decarb Future Economy Forum. So we are a team of students and climate-conscious scholars trying to bring together the best minds to discuss topical issues. And in these times where climate activism receives a lot of attention, we really believe in the power of rigorous evidence of guiding policy. And sort of our value add is of making that as accessible and widely available as possible. And we also try to inspire many policy and decision makers who are present here today to really fast-track progress on decarbonization as our common future depends on it. And on a personal note, I can just say that I founded the Decarb Future Economy Forum to share my excitement about cutting-edge research. And I'm very grateful that some of the very people who inspired me to pick up an economics PhD in my 30s are actually part of this event, which I'm very thankful for. And so, yes, we have a very exciting agenda ahead of us today, discussing questions such as, do the high energy prices lead to more green innovation, which is really needed to fast-track progress on decarbonization? How should the EU respond to the US Inflation Reduction Act? What role can empirical evidence play in this endeavor? And how will artificial intelligence encourage our capacity to innovate and use energy more efficiently? And last but not least, we're also very happy that Ufo Kasicic, so professor of economics at the University of Chicago, accepted our invitation to deliver our keynote speech today on the topic of green innovation, the most powerful engine to keep the climate from changing, where he's going to investigate the role of R&D, subsidies, and how they can be designed more effectively. So I really hope that we're all going to enjoy this conference and workshop today. And many thanks also for the many helping hands of the Decarb Future Economy Forum, which I see here in the rows. It was a lot of hard work behind the scenes. And so now we can all enjoy the fruits of this labor. And if you want to know more about us, check us out at decarb.world. And if you would like to get involved, we're always keen on new members. And yes, thank you so much, and looking forward now to the first keynote from Antoine. Yeah.
Okay, let me put timer, because I used to teach, so I can speak forever and people go crazy. So there you go. Okay, so well, first let me extend my thanks to the Hertie School for having us today, and to Decarb as well. So what I'll do now is so hopefully 15 minutes or so, I'll just throw you lots of figures from a paper we wrote recently with Chiara Criscolo, who's at the back there, and Dirk Pilat, our former deputy director, and Mario Cervantes, who's a colleague at the OECD, on low carbon innovation, the pace of innovation, what we need to do, how fast are we going, and hopefully that will be a good introduction to the panel that we have just after, but also for the rest of the day, I hope. So I don't need to spend a lot of time on the background. Everybody in this room, understands the challenge raised by our net zero targets. We need a profound transformation of the economy across all sectors. That requires, a massive technological transformation that's very clear to everyone here. And the key message is, for that to happen, we need innovation. Okay, and I think we need innovation for two reasons. One is to decrease the costs of existing technologies. Technologies that are already mature or close to maturity. We have observed over the last decade really, tremendous decreases in the cost of some low-carbon technologies, such as wind power or solar or batteries. It's, when you work on climate change, it's actually perhaps the only good news on the climate front for the last decade or so, I would say. And so we need to, this to happen in other technologies. And why is this? Well, because, when the cost of low-carbon technologies is on par with those of, fossil-based technologies, you don't need to think about climate policy anymore, okay? The market will just do the job. So that's the first reason. And, in many sectors, and in particular, I'm thinking the industry sector, costs, mitigation costs are still very high. And this is clear from the IPCC report, the latest one. So you need to reduce these costs further to accelerate diffusion. The other reason we need innovation so much is if you look at the International Energy Agency's net zero scenario, what's really interesting in there is that, to achieve our 2030 targets, we can do that with the technologies we have, okay? We need to speed up diffusion, certainly, but we can achieve this with the technologies we've got. But if you look at the 2050 targets, then what they say, is that half of the emission reductions to 2050, they will have to come from technologies that are still in prototype phase. They're still in the lab, basically, okay? And so we also need to, do more R&D to, develop these technologies further and perhaps, come up with brand new technologies. So that's the background. Now, what are we observing in terms of low-carbon innovation globally? And here's the first bad news, perhaps. If you look at patent filings, which is one measure of innovation activity, which is, of course, not all the innovation that's happening in the economy, that it's very far from this, but it's, it's a very interesting measure because we can very precisely identify all these innovations that cover low-carbon technologies. If you look at this, and you work out the proportion of patents globally, focusing on the high quality ones, between 1980 and 2020, which is what you're looking at here, there's been a massive increase in that proportion. So you can see here clearly in the years 2000, there was a doubling. Okay, and in 2012 also, about 12% of global innovation, as measured by patent filings, was going to low carbon technologies. But since 2012, it's been declining every year. Okay, that's up until 2020. We were updating these numbers, but that's of course not very encouraging that innovation in low carbon technologies is going down just when we need it the most. And in passing, you'll notice that the Paris Agreement in 2015 doesn't seem to have made any difference to that trend. So as I said, patent filings are just one measure of innovation. You need to look at other data. We're also looking at venture capital investment into green startups, and I'm sure we'll discuss this more with Tobias in the panel discussion. But if you look at this other measure of innovation, or at least because these are firms that are coming up with the technologies of the future, you also see as a share of total venture capital a recent decrease in the share of VC flowing to those startups developing climate technologies. And what is more, we see a declining and very small share of VC funding to green startups in seed funding. So what we think, is probably, a good indication of this kind of, very early stage innovation activity that's going on. Now, if you look at another completely different measure, which is trademark filings, so now we'll look, we don't look at innovation, we look at, more commercialization and new products, you see a very different picture, okay? We see an increasing trend across EU, US, Japan, all the countries for which we have data on trademark filing. So there seems to be, a focus on the commercialization, on the diffusion of technologies, which, is good news. But that's also, for that commercialization phase and not the innovation phase. And that's what I think is the worrying bit. So the next question is, why is low carbon innovation slowing down? Okay, so one clear, culprit here is fossil fuel prices. These low carbon technologies, definitely they are, fossil fuel energy saving technologies, okay, or nearly all of them, except perhaps for, CCS or things like this. But otherwise, they are technologies which, are there to save on fossil fuel energy. When the price goes down, of course, that reduces the incentives for firms to develop these technologies, because the future energy savings have a lower value. Okay, it's very simple. So that's one clear explanation. Of course, that fall in fossil fuel prices, which has reversed, and that's good news, perhaps. But until 2021, at least, that wasn't the case. That hasn't been compensated by, a large increase in carbon pricing. If you look at the data that we produce at the OECD on these effective carbon rates, 60% of the world's carbon emissions are still not priced at all, and only 10% are priced at above 60 euro. That's not news to anyone here, but of course, it's an important part of the explanation, I think. And more generally, this is also something that I find puzzling. If you look at the OECD indicator of environmental policy stringency, which is basically an indicator of climate and air pollution policy stringency, across OECD countries, despite the Paris Agreement and all these talks, in terms of, we've adopted very stringent targets now for 2050 and so on, but in terms of actual implementation of policies on the ground, it has in fact not become, not much more stringent over the past decade. We've seen an increase in climate policy uncertainty, which I think is also very bad for investment and innovation in particular. And when you look specifically at policies that are, directed or targeted at innovation, this is also not so good news. What this graph shows you is the public R&D expenditure for low-carbon technologies across OECD countries as a share of GDP, okay, since 1974. Okay, you can very clearly see the impact of the second oil shock there. Okay, but it has collapsed in the 80s, and since then it's flat. Okay, so we're spending as much on supporting low-carbon R&D now, or at least in 2021, which is the last year of data we have, as we were spending in the early 90s when climate change was not really so high in the agenda, and that, of course, is not helping. I see Nils already waving his hand, so probably I need to speed up. So, very small support to R&D. And especially small when you compare that to the support for for diffusion adoption. Okay, look at this graph. Here we measure the public support to R&D versus adoption in renewable energy technologies. In Japan, US, and the EU for the year when we have the data. In the EU, which is down there, the ratio of support is 1 to 150. So you put €1 on supporting R&D, 150 euros to support adoption. Okay, there is no single paper out there, and there's hundreds of papers that have been written on this. There is no single paper that would give you such an unbalanced ratio in terms of what the optimal policy mix should be. So some, rebalancing we think is in order. Okay, I really need to speed up. So there's a strong case for supporting low carbon R&D. I'm gonna go very fast. One important reason actually is it reduces the cost of reaching climate, objectives, and can allow policies on the carbon pricing front to be much lower. There are some, political economy reason also. There's, massive support for this type of, technology, low carbon technology support policies as compared to fossil fuel taxes and so on. So that's one extra reason. Okay, so basically what we say, and I'll conclude with this. Our point, what we think is, first reducing, there's a lot of talks of, mission innovation. We think the mission is very clear. Okay? The mission is reduce the cost of these technologies so that they become, competitive with the fossil fuel alternatives, and that goes, that will come partly from, green industrial strategies, which include innovation policies, and so we think these policies should, be a cornerstone of the climate policy package, and that means probably rebalancing these policies toward more support for these breakthrough technologies that we so desperately need, as opposed to support for mature technologies. Not that the mature technologies don't need any support, that's justified, but the balance is just not right. So if I would think the marginal euro should go to R&D support rather than adoption, and we need to use more direct instruments that have been shown to work in practice. We did a study on the Dutch climate policy package with my colleague Guy Lallan, who is here. And it was, they have a very, very economically efficient subsidy program to support the adoption and development of low carbon technologies, which is completely technology neutral. So basically you get a subsidy which is equal to the difference between the technology you propose, so the low carbon option, and the baseline. And they allocate the subsidies in, decreasing order of additional costs. So the cheapest technologies in terms of abatement get the subsidies first. But of course, when you do this, that really strongly supports already mature technologies that are very close to market, as opposed to the more further away technologies. And so that's why we're making this point that technology neutrality is not technology neutral. It favors the mature technologies by design, and so we need to complement this with other support for more early stage technologies. Of course, you also need to provide clear indication on the direction of change. There's a lot of evidence out there, showing that carbon pricing encouraging low carbon innovation. That's not very surprising to an economist. And again, I mean, in this study on the Netherlands, which I like, I mean, I don't like the study, but I like the policies that they have implemented. They came up with, a really interesting carbon price floor, which only kicks in gradually, so it doesn't impose any costs on the companies, but the path is already set for the next 10 years. So it provides this certainty to investors, which is super important for investment both in R&D and in adoption, without burdening companies immediately with taxes. And it's complemented with this policy to support this technology adoption at the same time. So there are some clever ways to provide these certainties that carbon prices can bring, without burdening firms. And I think this is going to be, I mean, probably we'll discuss this in the panel, but with the high energy prices and so on, it's an important part of the discussion. Okay, I'll skip this. That's of course not the whole policy package. Okay, so I'm done. Just 1 or 2 minutes late. Sorry, Nils. Okay, thank you.
need to press the red buttons.
This working now? Yes. Great. Antoine, thanks so much for the fascinating presentation. Really great. And we hear also, yes, so probably, as most of you know, Antoine Dechezleprêtre is senior economist at the OECD, was before that research fellow at the LSE Grantham. Eugenie Duoua is professor of environmental economics at the LSE. And Tobias Lechtenfeld here is partner at 1.5 Degree Ventures, doing startup finance for clean tech technologies. And so, yeah, Antoine, as you sort of rightly said, I think the elephant room is sort of why is green innovation not where it should be? I mean, we need it the most and it's going down. Is it sort of a measurement issue or is it a price issue? And now sort of given the current geopolitical tensions, energy prices are high. And so the first question, probably sort of for Eugenie and Tobias first, is sort of like, are the high energy prices going to incentivize a renaissance of fossil fuels? Because a high price of energy also incentivize, let's say, oil, gas, and coal, or accelerate the development and deployment of green technologies, and can potentially help close the carbon pricing gap. So you mentioned sort of the low current price level of carbon pricing. So can sort of the high energy prices help in that direction? So.
Thanks a lot, Nils. Yes, I think this works. Wonderful to be here. Thank you, Antoine, so much for, it's always a treat to listen to and see those really nice slides with those numbers that I think speak for themselves very clearly. And I want to thank the organizers as well for putting together this day. So to get at your question, Nils, like thinking a little bit more about the current context of energy prices and what could be the implications for green innovation. I sort of want to start the answer to this question in a sort of very academic way, because there is a lot of very robust evidence from many different economic studies that have studied the impact of changes in energy prices on innovation. That's kind of a very robust that we see again and again in many different studies, like when fossil fuel prices are higher, you see more innovation in energy savings, saving in technologies, but also in all, a whole range of clean technologies like renewables and so on. So we've seen this, already studies that were looking back at the effect of the changes in oil prices due to the oil crisis in the 70s. But more recently, I've done myself some work looking at, the variation in natural gas prices, mostly sort of due to the hydraulic fracking and the shale boom that happened in the US, Canada, and Mexico that's really led to massive decrease in natural gas prices. And we do see that is impacting what firms and individual inventors are doing. Now, this little sort of caveat to that is like, those changes, happen. It's unclear how agents in the economy interpret how long-term and those changes are going to be, right? So you can think about them as this impacting green innovation at the margin. You may see like it's kind of positive news for clean innovation. It should foster clean innovation. But the question is, for how long do we think these shocks are really going to be persistent, and to a certain extent, if the economic agents don't think like that the increase in energy prices is going to be there for the next 3 decades, it may do not so much. It may do give us a little bit more clean innovation. But it may not give the right incentives for dirty and green innovation. All the while, I think you can still see a boom in like green and dirty innovations, because that may actually induce firms to make their technology more efficient as energy prices are increasing. So I think there's this question of like long-term expectation, which goes back into like the issue of policy uncertainty. Well, in this context, kind of price uncertainty, right? If agents don't believe those price hikes are there to stay, then we may expect something at the margin to happen, but maybe not, to the scale and extent that that seems necessary.
Thank you. On the same line, but first of all, also from my end, thank you for putting this event together, also for inviting me. Antoine, I love your work. I mean, I think this is really important. I think it really points the finger to some of the key challenges that we see. At the same time, as an economist, of course, you always wonder, so how was it aggregated? My personal feeling would be, let's kick out everything nuclear from the data and see actually how the trajectory runs. Not, regardless of where you stand on nuclear energy, but you may see a slightly different trajectory. Especially in the 70s, there was basically hidden subsidies for the nuclear sector. And then on green tech investment, the one thing that always drives me crazy, especially in this city, that everything gets clubbed into green tech. If you go out on the street and you fall over an e-scooter that has zero climate impact, it's considered a climate investment. Some of the largest VC rounds in the last years were in tier and whatever they're called, and these things don't have a climate impact. Zero. They run on a battery that's negative to produce, and they don't replace any traffic. And I think the data, so micromobility is not to club everything into one corner, but basically I think what we need to do is we need to sort the innovation by CO2 impact. And I think then we may actually see that one IP on a catalyzer for a new electrolyzer is actually able to bring the price point down for green hydrogen by 20%. That's one patent of the TU Berlin, potentially, if it's scaled, compared to like 50 IPs somewhere else in the world that basically do virtually nothing on shifting the cost curve. Because I think, exactly as you pointed out, in the end, it's not just about the amount of IP, not the amount of research or patents, but how they're able to bring the price point down of all these technologies, right? So with PV, with solar energy, we've seen this 30 years, super expensive when they started, and now finally solar energy is cheaper than fossil, if we didn't tie the energy prices together for whatever reason. So we could actually beat fossil and drive fossil energy out of the market if we were able to disconnect the energy market, and we would have actually solar energy and wind energy freely competing with the energy prices on gas and oil, for example. So I'd say there's some play in this. We could, from an operational level, I would say the big question that drives us and also keeps us up at night is like, it's not just how do you get the innovation done, so basically the invention at the university level or research at Fraunhofer level, but how do you get it onto the road, right? How do you spin it out? How do you scale it? How do you make a business case out of someone wrote a PhD paper? That's hard enough, but then how do you turn that into a company that scales? Because otherwise it won't run it. And so maybe we can discuss that also a bit more. Thanks.
Sure, absolutely. And Antoine, I'm not sure if you sort of have anything sort of on the question of the carbon prices. Just simply, for example, I think yesterday I read Germany is going to sort of put 30 billion into fixing, like capping electricity prices, which if you would put 30 billion into sort of like this R&D public expenditure, sort of would we see sort of this green patent sort of graph tick up again, or sort of, I don't know, where do you see us developing sort of with the current price level and sort of also, unfortunately, let's say, some political ambitions to cap it and not just, because otherwise, so like, I guess the high prices would automatically induce the green innovation which we need so much.
Yeah, I mean, on this, there is clearly what is the word in English? You can't at the same time, increase support for these clean technologies and so on, which we've seen actually in the 2 or 3 recent years with all these recovery packages, for example, and we're going to launch a study on this next week, and at the same time, massively increase all these fossil fuel subsidies in an untargeted way, and so on. There is clearly a split personality disorder type of issue here. You can't send these opposite signals to the market because it creates this. It adds to this uncertainty in terms of where are we going, and on this point I really agree with Eugenie's points on expectation. The expectations of future prices and future climate policies is really what is driving all this investment, from innovation to commercialization, and that's where policies should act. Okay, and that's why we like instruments like carbon contracts for differences and all these things that create this policy stability that we need. On your question of the impact of the current energy price, so beyond this question of expectations, there is obviously there's competition between these two technologies, the dirty and the clean, as you call them, Eugenie, and the high price also, incentivizes oil and gas companies to explore more, look for more reserves. So yeah, it's not totally clear, and that's again why we need to send a signal that this is a new regime, and prices will remain high. And if they go down, they'll be, complemented by some carbon prices, which, create this certainty. Okay. I also take your point of the scaling innovation by CO2 emissions. That's basically you're getting at my fantasies here, Tobias. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to do this yet, but we're on it.
Yeah. Speaking of Antoine's fantasies, so I'm going to dodge the nuclear question because, you both are French, we're two Germans. I think there's not that much room for agreement, but...
Okay, on nuclear. Not on the... not on whether we're for, against or for nuclear, but your point, Tobias, that get rid of nuclear. Why cannot we put the same monies that we put on nuclear 20 years ago, massively, on green hydrogen, on CCUS, on other things? It's not about nuclear, but it's about the effort. We made it. We decided to put it on nuclear. You think it's not a good idea, but at least we should do the same for these other technologies we need so desperately.
And I'm just wondering, Tobias, since you're very practical perspective, Antoine mentioned the IEA report on net zero, which puts carbon capture and storage and hydrogen at the forefront of these ambitions, and what other technologies, maybe not e-scooters, but I don't know, concrete, carbon steel, hard to abate sectors, I don't know, bioeconomy, what are those sectors, which then you could rank and what are on top of the priority list apart from hydrogen and CCS, CCU.
So this is actually at the heart of what we do every day, right? So we are not a classical VC investor, as you find in Berlin. We're actually a venture studio. That means we build climate tech companies, and we do it pretty much by asking exactly that question. We read the IPCC report backwards. We look at where the emissions are from. We break it down to the chemical and physical processes, and then we look at who's running the breakthrough research, the frontier research in these areas, and then you very quickly come out. Very different from the US, for instance, where you have the Ivy League. You come out pretty much in all over Germany and Europe, because it's really hidden in the smallest places that you would never expect. Right? So Germany's leading carbon capture company comes from a really tiny chair of research in Essen-Bochum. You would have never guessed it there. But of course, there's also a lot of stuff from Fraunhofer, from Luft- und Raumfahrtzentrum, the DLR, to Berlin, to Munich. Of course, the big names have a lot of stuff that they yield. If you rank it by emissions, it's probably the biggest one. The single biggest one is industrial heat, because it's half of industry emissions, roughly speaking. So that's somewhere between 11 and 13% of all emissions are just from burning gas to create heat. That's it. Now, everybody has an electric oven at home that goes up to 400 degrees if you don't block it. So we can do electric heat. We can electrify a lot of the industrial heat today off the shelf. There's not even innovation, that's just deployment, right? So that's an easy one. Then you have the more tricky ones where you need to bring the price point down. On energy, on industry, on less on mobility, because that's really moving. There's a lot going on already. So that's, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do more on mobility, but in terms of the deployment of mobility, the solutions, there's a lot going on already. The hardest one is probably construction, buildings, and agriculture. These two. And agriculture is the toughest one because it's biology. We cannot change how animals or the biology emits methane or CO2. That's just we can insulate our buildings so they lose less heat in the winter. That's easy. That's physical, but we can't do that with a cow, not easily. Let's say not straightforward. So maybe just one point on the price point, because we really don't have 30 years again to bring down the price points of all these technologies as we've done with solar. So the only way to do this from an industrial policy perspective, in our view, is actually to create a demand stimulus, not supply subsidies, as Germany and many other countries have done for the last 50 years, but only focus on demand. Make sure you generate offtake. And of course, not the state should buy these things, but look at either protected markets. So for instance, in aviation fuels, we now have a quota. It mandates the airlines to add just a couple percentage points of green fuels, but that creates a market for dozens of new e-fuel companies in aviation, and that will eventually lead to the scaling of these technologies, because they now have a protected market where they can actually compete with each other and no longer have to compete with fossil. And that is smart industrial policy that costs us nothing. It's a quota from a taxpayer's perspective. Right? We have other elements, for example, green public procurement. Please don't use it for everything. Use it only for the biggest items the government shops, which is buildings. No one builds more than our governments. No one uses more concrete and asphalt than our governments. Every metro station, every school building, every sidewalk is emissions, right? Like cement, most of you will know this, 8% of global emissions. If the government puts in their technical requirements, I want carbon neutral concrete, they get it. It's available on the market today, but you pay 3% more per project. Can we afford 3% more per project? Sure we can. That's nothing compared to the cost of climate change that's heading towards us, right? So government can walk the talk. They can also mandate all of us to change our gas heaters. But first of all, I think they need to do their job to decarbonize the public sector, and that's especially in public fleets, and that's in concrete, right? So two very big emission sources you can do ASAP this year still. And then you have smarter but much more complicated instruments like the carbon contracts for difference, or just contract for difference as we have for hydrogen. They are amazing if you do a PhD, because you can really play with them and the carbon pricing, everything. But they are super dangerous because of the political capture. So if you're doing a PhD in political economy, I think there is a lot there to see basically how industry captures these smart climate instruments and abuses them for just bankrolling dinosaur technologies. And so we got to be really careful how we design them, and always focus everything on CO2, so that we go away from political kind of wishful thinking. Right? So our government here, I think that's really kudos to them. They have just launched a CCFD. It's very smart because it's merit-based on CO2 impact. So they will only provide the OPEX subsidy to the projects that apply with the largest CO2 impact. And that's really nice, because it's basically it's a kind of safeguard against political capture and stuff like that. So you can do it right. I mean, let's see how it rolls out in practice. But it's not an easy one, and a lot of policymakers are not attuned, I think, to having CO2 as their North Star in everything they do in industrial policy.
Great, thanks so much.
Can I respond to a few things? So a couple of thoughts here, and I will, for the sake of the debate, do a bit of a devil's advocate and push back on some of the things you said, because I do hear, the call for, the demand side to be more robust, to have subsidies here and there, that we have the technologies. somehow, and that's my voice. Okay. I think there is actually a public opinion fight to be led around this idea that yes, we do know how to decarbonize some technologies, and some are like fairly cheap to do, and we should go ahead. But there is also a lot of sectors and a lot of emissions in the economy that are not going to be sort of like a free lunch to decarbonize, and so I sympathize with the idea that 3% of like a price premium in like say the cement is not a lot. But given the industrial organization of that particular sector, maybe it's actually too much, and there is no incentive to do that. Like I don't know what the path-through would be, like who would end up paying the 3%, and at the end of the day, it may even if it's 3%, if we were to say, it costs 3% of GDP every year to kind of decarbonize, maybe you and I may think it's not a lot, but politically speaking, it's still 3%, right? And so you will always have people on the other side of the aisle that will rather spend the 3% in different ways or have like less public debt. So I think, it's tricky to understand technological progress as a binary thing. I would, it's a continuum of things. I don't think it means something to say like we have technologies. Well, I don't know what it means. Do we have them on paper in the lab? Is it a prototype? Has it been demonstrated? Is it commercially available? Like there's all of these different stages. I think some of the graphs that Antoine put up there, that by the targets for 2030, which is like 8 years from now, that sounds, as ridiculous as it sounds. But so in 8 years, maybe we can do minus 50% reduction with what we have, but meaning like what is commercially available. But I think the net zero is kind of very much out of reach in terms of like how do we, build a resilient grid. Even if we want to electrify all we want, like we will need a grid that is resilient. And I think there are big questions around energy storage. I think decarbonizing industry, aviation, marine, shipping, and all of this. Like I don't think we have today things that are close to being commercially available. I mean, for sure, you work closer to the upstream part as a venture capitalist person. You are exactly at the perfect position. Like you're in between, what's coming upstream, and you're there to facilitate the scale up. So you probably feel like we have everything because you see it. But I the numbers shows that especially in Europe we spend proportionally so much more on demand side than supply side compared to the US in particular. So I think I urge everyone to think carefully about like why is it that the EU hasn't spent more on building sort of the innovation machine. Maybe there are very good reason for that. But I think when you compare with what the US has spent on energy, and even though the US decrease in percentage term compared to what they used to spend during the oil crisis. I mean, surely we think climate change is a bigger reason to invest than, the oil crisis of the 70s. This were point of cautions. But.
Cool. Nils, can I jump in? Just for clarification, 2 things. So my point is really that from a public sector perspective, we need to invest the little money we have left into the things that make the biggest impact now. So get your biggest CO2 bang for your buck. I think that's my point. And so when you list public policies, industrial policy that you can use to decarbonize, it turns out, if you list them also, you have your metrics by sector, by emission source, and you kind of put a number of CO2 reduction on it, you'll find that actually green public procurement for concrete is one of the cheapest way to reduce 8% of Europe's emissions now. We have everything it takes. And this is why it's mind-blowing to me that this is not yet passed in Parliament. What is this 3%? If I build, let's say, this university building with a lot of concrete steel, but I also need an architect, I also need floors, I need the electrician, I need the painter. I mean, it's a lot more than the concrete, right, this building. So the total project cost will go up by 3% of a building like this. We actually ran this for a new university in Munich that was just built. the concrete, the bag of cement, that itself costs more than 3% more. But because the project in infrastructure is so expensive, the total project increase is 3%. That's in the margin of everyone. Plus, we are paying it as taxpayers. So we can pay with just a 3% premium on public buildings. We can create a market for green cement, and that can bring the emissions down. That's the logic here. Yeah, so it's not, just to be very precise, so this for me is a demand instrument because it creates a demand pull for green cement, which otherwise sits out there in the shelves, and you're totally right. Why would a normal person in the market buy green cement if the fossil cement is just as good? There's no incentive to do so. I think the other argument for me that's really, really, really important is we do not have the time for more lab work. We need to deploy now what we have. This planet is heating way too fast, much faster than was forecasted, because we were always sold the conservative model. And turns out, guess what? In economics, you never end up at the lower bar. You always end up roughly in the middle. That's what distribution statistics is all about. So of course it's hotter than we thought it would be. The storms are more intense. The melting points, the tipping points are coming much faster than we thought. And that means we need to decarbonize now. We don't have another 10 or 20 years to invent stuff, whether it's carbon storage in the North Sea. I don't know when that comes. It's too late. So what do we have available now? What can we actually literally deploy in the next 5 years and scale? And there's maybe not 100 technologies. It's maybe just 20. But let's get going and let's look at them and say, okay, what do they need to get a business case to scale commercially? Because frankly, we don't have the government pockets, not even a country like Germany, which everyone in Europe is complaining about, that we are outspending our neighbors and over-subsidizing our industries and basically put everyone out of business in the future. We need to be very careful that we leverage private money. We need to bring in our banks, our family offices, our investors. Germany or Europe is not a poor region. There's a lot of wealth out there, but let's get away, please, from using just tax money. Yeah, and I'm not saying that with a political agenda. I'm saying that from a pure economist, analytics, like, we don't have the money, so let's leverage private money. What do we need to activate loans? Well, maybe we need a loan guarantee that costs us almost nothing. We've just done that during the COVID crisis. 25 billion have been handed out in loan guarantees. That costs you virtually nothing from a taxpayer's perspective, and it activates billions, like a multitude of private investments, right? So these are the kind of instruments I would love to discuss and see much more, because that gets us going. And of course, we still need innovation for the race then to 2050. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we should shut down innovation, quite the opposite. But like for now, until 2030, let's go with what we got, because it's the only chance we have.
I was just wondering, Antoine, since I sort of read your chart that it's too much focus on sort of like deployment, too little on development. So I don't know, would you agree with Tobias? Or?
Yeah, I think Tobias makes very important points in terms of the efficiency of public spending, and but to me the conclusion to that is, or the question is, what instruments for what technologies, depending on where we are in the technology readiness level. And what I am seeing, for example, on hydrogen, and we did a study on hydrogen, again with Guy Lallan, who is here. It was really interesting to see that, the type of instruments that are chosen by governments to support the deployment of hydrogen are already these, demand-side policies like public procurement and, subsidized, prices. But we're putting the, cart before the horse here, okay? How much is the global production of green hydrogen? 0, okay? Well, a few thousand tons, okay? How much is the global production of gray hydrogen? 90 million tons. And already, so in the US IRA, for example, there is a tax credit, $3 per kilo of hydrogen, of green hydrogen, which is, 3 times the cost of gray hydrogen. We're already using instruments that should be, used for concrete, which is only 3%, green concrete, which is already 3% more expensive, to incentivize the development of technologies that are at a much earlier stage of development. And that's not what we should be doing. We should be probably spending that money on, these kind of least cost options in the short run on these technologies that are very close to maturity already, and for technologies that are at a much earlier stage, like green hydrogen, spend the next decade doing research and decreasing those costs. Of course, the cost will also decrease by scaling up, but that can perhaps wait a couple of years, and in the meantime. So I think that's the balance we should be thinking about.
Great, perfect. And sort of speaking maybe of political economy, I remember like the one graph where sort of you had the subsidies, and then first a very high level of subsidies, and then like the increasing price of carbon. So Eugenie, I think you sort of done some research on sort of the sequencing of, let's say, ambition of international agreements, and so like how that can eventually increase also ambition locally for such things as stricter regulation. So, yeah.
Yeah, and actually, that was going to be a follow-up point, like this idea that, for what we want to do in the very short term, of course, we need to focus on the things that are going to give us the biggest bang for the buck, right? I think nobody is debating that. But it doesn't necessarily mean, public money either. Like the best policy is the one that's not going to crowd out private money either. But there is also, I think, we need to think harder about the global cooperation problem here in the context of green technological change. I love the Paris Agreement, but as an economist, I have to acknowledge that the Paris Agreement doesn't have a binding mechanism in the economic sense of it. So, it's a series of pledges. Maybe there will be some shaming, naming and shaming, and maybe countries will increase their pledges and even deliver on their pledges. But really, and there's early evidence that this is not happening really. So it's nice to have ambition, but how do we convert these ambitions into actual actions? So in one of my research, I've revisited a lot what happened when we had the ozone depletion problem, and how we had this Montreal Protocol in '87, which is really the only successful example of a global cooperation problem that we solved. The next best is in fact the grandkid of Montreal, which is the Kigali Agreement, there a couple of years back that we negotiated, which will help climate as well. So what I've learned, through my work thinking about Montreal is what Montreal de facto did is it made countries agreed on some targets that looked reasonably feasible, not too crazily ambitious, but it enforced those ambitions by connecting trade to the environmental targets. So the Montreal Protocol had trade restrictions, so if the countries did not respect their reduction in CFCs, which were the pollutants that we were trying to reduce at the time, they could actually be banned from exporting any products that would contain CFCs, and that included any cars, fridges, and air conditioners as well. In fact, those trade restrictions never had to be used because very quickly the chemical industry, made available substitute, and the innovation machine was very fast to respond. And what's interesting in terms of global cooperation is what we see is a couple of years after this Montreal Agreement is agreed in '87, you have increased research and patenting in areas related to CFC substitutes, and in a couple years later you have a new agreement internationally that increase ambition. So you have new targets that are now more ambitious, and also they increase the scope of the number of pollutants they want to deal with. So I think there's this telling you that this kind of induced innovation mechanism and dealing with corporations can work hand in hand, right? You start agreeing with something that looks reasonable, that really change expectations because you have an economically binding mechanism. So you give a really strong signal that all the key actors for that particular technologies or aligned in terms of what's the medium and long-term direction is. And then a couple of years later, they realized, they've done some work, they realized, well, it's actually not that hard, we can do a bit more now, and so on. And at the end of the day, this kind of step-by-step process, I think, has been extremely important. And I think the parallel for climate here is like, focusing on particular sector. There is a bigger push now for thinking about sectoral agreements. And I'm thinking of the agreement between the EU and the US a couple years back for the steel and aluminum sector as, I think, a good step in the right direction, trying to think about a particular sector and thinking about how to actually connect trade to that sector so that the imports in aluminum and steel are on sort of an equal footing, and that should kind of help those actors coordinate into the right direction. Thank you.
Perfect. Really great. Yeah.
Are you going to take questions from the audience? I have some questions from the online audience, actually.
We have 10 more minutes. Yes. Why don't we? Sure.
So because that connects very well with it connects well with what you just said, Christian Seidlinger of the GITS, so basically the agency that coordinates development cooperation, is asking. So after all these ideas you've discussed, do you see that political actors in the big polluting countries, so he's saying industrial but also emerging, are going into the right direction? $100,000 question.
Antoine, you want to?
Collect a few questions, or? So maybe just quickly on this one, I would say actually there's a lot of stuff moving. Countries like Norway obviously are ahead of the curve because they really thought this through, and they're using now their oil proceeds from the last decades to really invest more than anyone into green technologies. But even countries like India, if you really look at what they're doing on their coal policy, they're looking at Europe and saying, guys, can you please do the first step? We'll need that as a proof point, and then we can also follow you. And we need your technologies because we don't have them at home, right? I think this is always what we forget, that, yeah, maybe Germany is just 1% of global population, 2% of emissions, but we also 60% of the technology for climate change. So, we have a reason we're set up to really benefit from this if we play it well. But I think there's a lot happening actually in those countries with the highest emissions. And then you have a few shaky candidates, I guess, in the Gulf. They're not quite sure yet which direction to go.
Yes, hi. Johnny West from Carbon Tracker. It seems to me that this whole spectrum of discussion is kind of wedged in between two things at the ends. One is pure politics, because you're talking a lot about policy, but the politics connected to the policy. And the other one is pure science. If we just look at politics first, perhaps one elephant in the room is that why is there such an imbalance in Europe between investment in deployed technologies as opposed to R&D? Is because the orthodox green movement, which may only represent 10 to 15% of voting, but is 90% plus of political energy and ownership of the issue, says day after day after day, we have all the technologies we need. And it's a major, major battle line drawn that gets thousands of people out in the streets in this city and in other cities and so on. And I don't mean to single out, because on the other side of the equation, why is 30 billion going into subsidies which wouldn't go into R&D and so on? Because there's a general perspective that you might call centre of right complacency, which says things are so tough all the time, they're always tough because of COVID and Ukraine and whatever it happens to be, that all of this stuff is highfalutin, and all of those people with degrees, that's what they worry about, and so on. So where's political economy in terms of trying to find ways through those forests at one end? And then on the science, and it's something I know nothing about, I'd be interested in your reactions to the work of people like Václav Smil, who suggests that innovation rates around physical processes cannot consistently attain, more than 5 or 6% a year. And you're right to distinguish biological from, let's say, industrial processes, which are a result of many, societal decisions. But ultimately, most of the innovation involves trying to manipulate physical processes and so on. So how does that feed in? And very specifically, is it a case when confronted with a series of technologies that could be developed on, that some of them fall into kind of known unknown categories in which that's a reasonable bet to get incremental innovation, others of them fall into unknown categories in which you just have to throw it at the wall and see what sticks? How does that all play out? Thank you.
Heino von Meyer. I've 3 decades with the OECD, but now work on green hydrogen and Power-to-X. I try to be short. Antoine, there is an implicit message, if I get you right, concerning technology neutrality, which is courageous for an OECD economist. I guess colleagues in the economics directorate don't like that message, and we have a very lively political debate in Germany and I'm sure in other countries. Could you clarify that position? And I think if I listen to Tobias, it is very explicit. We don't have the time for arguing for neutrality, and public procurement might be a way of really pushing where the push needs to be. As I said, I'm an economist, OECD background, but I think the debate about technology neutrality is really supporting the incumbents, as you have said. But I don't know how courageous you can be.
Hello, my name is Radha and I'm a public policy student here in Hertie School and I'm from India. My first question, I have 2 questions. My first question is for Tobias. You talked about how Germany can take the lead and develop technology and the other countries like India can follow. But I feel like there's a danger of European energy imperialism, which might follow. And speaking of hydrogen, I think countries like Namibia, which are already suffering from water scarcity, hydrogen might not be the best solution for them. So what can we do to solve this? And my second question is for Antoine. Yeah. You, in your presentation, you talked about patents not capturing all of innovation. So from an economics perspective, what can we do to better measure innovation in our economy so that we can direct flows in the right direction? And also there was a difference between patents and trademarks, which pardon me, I did not quite understand. So could you please throw some light on that? Thank you so much.
Okay, shall we take them now? And you go, okay. Okay, on the very first online question, I just wanted to say one thing, which is one thing which makes me optimistic. We've been, over the last year and a half, we've been working on these, post-COVID recovery packages, including the European Resilience and Recovery Facility, all these, our recovery and resilience plans, the US IRA, and so on. And over those 2 years, 2021, about $1.3 trillion globally has been announced. The spending is already coming out of the door, but 1.3 trillion of measures have been taken to support specifically development and deployment of low carbon technologies including about 100 billion specifically for R&D and demonstration. And so this is really, I think, good news. We will actually be launching this next week. We can perhaps see with our colleagues from Hertie School and OECD Berlin if we can disseminate this, the registration link to all of you. So this is a right step. But now, if you look at the IEA, net zero scenario, which I mentioned before, how much do they say we should, invest additionally globally to reach our climate targets? 1.2 trillion per year. Okay, so it's really striking. In terms of investment, what we need is about one, COVID recovery package every year. Okay. Yeah. Now, remember. So that sounds impossible, right? But remember that this is both public and private money, okay? And we know that the majority of that investment will have to come from the private sector. So I think, these recent measures are really encouraging, and, governments have, done their job in a sense. But now what we need is the incentives. We need to put in place the incentives so that the private sector takes its share and does this, investment also. And I think that's what's, missing, because we can't expect, governments to fund the low carbon transition all by themselves. On technology neutrality, the OECD has changed, or at least we're trying to change that message. It's not that we are, against or for, technology neutrality. So first, there is an urgency issue, but there is also just, where our business is evidence-based policy, and there is evidence that the type of innovation that you incentivize with technology-neutral instruments like R&D tax credits, and the type of firms that react to these incentives is different, from what you incentivize with direct, grants or other R&D support instruments. And you can also target different types of firms like SMEs, or startups who don't pay taxes, so they, R&D tax credits for them are basically useless. So, what we're saying is just if you use technology neutral instruments, that's fine, and in the short run it has some benefit in terms of, the efficiency of public spending, which we discussed before. But it's not gonna, that's not gonna get us to net zero, that's for sure. R&D tax credits are not gonna get us to net zero. So it has to be complemented with other forms of, more direct instruments. So that's I think, the message, which is perhaps a bit more nuanced than what you might have heard in the past. I'm speaking too much. I'll perhaps come back if there's more.
You want to talk on hydrogen?
Maybe just really briefly. So I think, why do some technologies not scale in the way? Why do some innovations not actually leave the lab so fast? It's because of the innovation curse. If you're an investor, or even your company, and you want to buy the latest technology on the market, you can do that today. You're going to invest heavily in the capex, so the installation cost. 2 years down the road, someone invented something better, more efficient, 10% more efficient. Your competitor just basically beat you to the market simply because you move too fast. And it's that innovation curse that holds back a lot of decision taking. If you look at shipping industry, they're sitting there on the sidelines of their ports saying, is it going to be ammonia or is it going to be methanol? We don't know. We're not going to move because we don't know where the market develops. Because if you take a wrong decision, you're out of business, right? Shipping just got solved, so that's good news. It's methanol. But there are other technologies where this is really holding back innovation. And you see it in green hydrogen rollout. We have amazing catalysts out there that can bring the price point down today by 20, 30%. But nobody builds them because the old ones in the shelves haven't amortized yet, right? So there's a logic out there in the market that is, I think this is much more pertinent to a lot of these things that we really need to figure out. And so my big plea also to this room of both political scientists, political economists, and economists is like, let's look at how to mobilize the private resources Let's look at how we can make sure public government, public policy is ranked by CO2 impact of what it does, so that we can actually get these coins rolling. We can't just sit here and expect the private market to invest into something that we as society or policymakers wish should be done. That's not how the world works. Right? And I think we know better. I think we actually have the tools in our toolbox. And I think I'd love to see those kind of studies, those kind of policies, those kind of debates. How do we get this done? Because we've done it before.
I'm just wondering, Eugenie, since sort of Tobias was talking about technological uncertainty, sort of you looked at the car industry, sort of can you just briefly, sort of before we move to lunch, sort of tell us something we can learn? It's something sort of like how sort of when it was unclear whether, internal combustion engine, sort of electric lithium-ion batteries or the fuel cell was going to win the race, sort of, how did that shape up?
Yeah, no, but very quickly, I mean, I sympathize with the, tech neutral kind of idea or ideal, but I think there are also coordination externalities in this transition to green tech that we have to think about carefully. Hydrogen is a case in point where multiple sectors are concerned. Many things have to happen at different places, different point in time. And so unless all the agents in the economy are clear that that is actually the choice, that is that's the technology that's being chosen, you may have like miscoordination on investments. And I think the story of why we are potentially going to all end up buying a battery EV, if you haven't yet, as opposed to a full cell EV, 10, 15 years ago, the odds were out, fuel cell, the prospect for fuel cell EV looked pretty good. But suddenly, there was almost like a tipping point where the car industry really shifted and everyone was sort of aligned that the future of clean cars was into battery EV. And like to be very short, you can think of like one of the key reasons why we're going to end up with BEV, at least in the medium term, has much less to do with careful green industrial policy, but rather serendipitous spillovers from consumer electronics, billions of consumers buying smartphones and computers that really pushed down the cost of batteries. And at some point, the costs were low enough that even for the car industry, they realize, all right, this is what's going to happen. It makes the infrastructure issue much less. Not easy, right? We still have to build charging stations everywhere, but at least you don't have to worry about where the hydrogen is going to come from, because electricity, there's a grid around here. So again, thanks for letting me this opportunity to make a point about that. Thank you, Nils.
Perfect. I think that was a great end note to this wonderful poem. Thanks all for your questions, and I think we're ready for lunch.